Hey guys, I'm going to read chapter 12. We only have about 20 pages left. Um, so this might be a little bit of a longer read aloud, but I want to finish it this week. So just listen carefully. On Friday, you will have a reading response due to me. So just like I said, make sure you're listening, and we're going to finish this book by the end of the week. Okay, so here we are, chapter 12. Ellen had just kind of met with a blacksmith. She was in there warming up, and an old man who was questioning her about the bread. Okay? All right, chapter 12. Here we are. She was out in the cold, black night again, and now there was no spot of light ahead to give her courage to push on. Everything had gone wrong today. Now remember, this has only been one day. So here she is, it's nighttime, okay? Just earlier that day in the morning is when grandfather had fallen. This is the same day. Grandfather had fallen, hurt his leg, his ankle, couldn't go to deliver this message. Ellen, and here she is in one day. All right, this is really a lot that's happened. Over and over again, she was so miserable she wanted to sink down in the snow and go to sleep. She heard some horsemen come galloping down the road and quickly dodged out of the way. She could not see them as they disappeared in the dark, but she could hear them round a bend in the road ahead and then suddenly stop. Far away she heard the burst of laughter as if a door had been opened and closed again. That might be the tavern. It was almost too much to hope for, but it made sense. It might be the tavern. When she came to the bend, she saw a group of horses tied to a long hitching post. A light from a small lantern in a window shone on a sign above the doorway. It was the picture of a smiling fox. The Jolly Fox Tavern at last. She made it! She had found it. Ellen pushed open the door and stumbled into a room that seemed to be bouncing with laughter and singing. It smelled of hot food and old ale and muddy boots. Candles on the table and a crackling fire in a huge fireplace made the room glow. Sprawled on chairs around the long tables were many red-coated officers. They smoked their white pipes, banged their mugs on the bare boards, and joked with two nimble waitresses in white caps and long green aprons. Beside the fireplace at the far end of the room, Ellen saw a bar with slats of wood from counter to ceiling. She had never been in a tavern before and had never seen a little room like this. It looked like a cage. The shelves at the back were filled with wine bottles and mugs and pewter tankards. White clay tobacco pipes hung from the rafters overhead, waiting to be borrowed by the customers. Inside the cage, a plump little woman was drawing ale from a keg into a row of mugs. She, too, wore a long green apron, and in her ears were gold earrings that sparkled when she turned her head in time to the tune she was whistling. A small British flag was stuck jauntily in her white topknot. "Is this Mistress Shannon?" Ellen wondered. So she had like her hair pulled up and then a little tiny British flag in there. The little white-haired woman pushed 4 mugs along the counter and called to a waitress. "Don't keep the gentleman waiting." Then she turned to Ellen. "What's your pleasure, sir?" She threw back her head and started to laugh. "You're about as small as they come," she chuckled. "May I see Mr. Shannon?" Ellen asked. She was impatient because the woman was so slow. Now that she was here, she wanted to thrust the bread into Mr. Shannon's hands. Who was this woman with the British flag in her white hair? So Ellen walks into this tavern, okay, the Jolly Fox. She's finally made it. There's British there, red coats, so we know that they're British. Here's this woman. Can't possibly be Mrs. Shannon, right? She's all cheerful and she's serving the red coats. She's got a little British flag in her hair. If I were Ellen, I'd be worried. Am I in the wrong spot? Because I'm delivering a message for George Washington, who is the enemy to these redcoats. And here's this woman just, acting like she loves Great Britain. The woman started singing in a loud voice as she wiped her hand on the towel at her waist. Her eyes darted quickly about the room as she leaned forward and put her head through the gateway of her cage. "Mr. Shannon's not here," she said. "Not here?" Ellen was filled with dismay. "He has gone to the country to find a few kegs of ale." "Gone?" cried Ellen in a voice that was sharp and frightened. What did she mean, gone? Grandfather said he would be here, waiting for her. "When will he be back?" she asked desperately. The woman was banging mugs on the counter and making a great clatter with some dishes. In a day or two, no telling when. She seemed to be looking past Ellen at the soldiers in the room. "I've come a long way," Ellen began, but the woman's loud singing drowned out her words. When she could interrupt her, Ellen pleaded, "And I must find him now. Can you help me?" "He's gone to the country," the woman said again in a very loud voice. So think about this. Ellen's trying to talk to this woman, and she's banging dishes, and she's making all this clatter, and she's like, "Oh no, Mr. Shannon's not here. He's gone away." She's kind of being a little bit, I don't want to say sneaky, but almost questionable. Okay, so if you were Ellen, you'd be wondering, why is this lady not really talking to me? She just keeps shouting out that Mr. Shannon's not here. All right, so think about that. Then she leaned across the counter and whispered, "Just sit by the fire, boy." Her face was filled with friendly concern. "Just close your eyes and don't talk to anyone at all. I'm Mr. Shannon's wife." And with that, she went back to the keg of ale, picking up the song the soldiers were singing and shouting it as lustily as they. The little flag fluttered with each toss of her hand. Ellen wanted to give Mr. Shannon the loaf of bread and be done with it, but she remembered her grandfather's warning: give the bread to no one but Mr. Shannon. Two redcoats moved their outstretched legs to make way for her as she stumbled over to the fire and sat down on a low stool. On a spit before the fire, a roast of mutton was sizzling and sputtering, but not even the smell of a good hot roast made her hungry. She was too tired and upset and numb with shock. So she's shouting with these soldiers, she's singing with them, she's acting very friendly with the British soldiers, right? And really what she's kind of doing is like tricking the British soldiers, almost, is telling Ellen, "Go sit by the fire." And then she's going off, okay? As she watched the leaping flames, her head whirled with memories of the day. They went past her eyes in a dizzy parade. A boat full of soldiers, so Ellen is thinking about her day. A boat full of soldiers, the crowded streets of Amboy, the woods, that pig! Remember the pig? And for what? For nothing. Mr. Shannon wasn't even here, so she did all of this for what? She can't even give the bread to Mr. Shannon. All that she had endured meant nothing in the end. She could sit here and wait all she liked. Mr. Shannon wouldn't be back for 2 days. And if you remember, this letter had to get there today because the courier was coming to pick it up and take it to Mr. Washington. This was all very time-sensitive material. Nobody could send George Washington a text and say, "Hey, listen, go attack the soldiers on this night now, or tonight." This stuff took days because there was no mail every day. It was people sneaking, okay, meeting this person here, this person here. It took a long time to do these secret messages. Angrily, she kicked off her wet shoes and shoved them towards the fire. She leaned forward, doubling up over the loaf of bread inside her jacket. She put her head on her knees and she let her arms flop down. She was too tired to move. The noise of the tavern swirled about her, but Ellen barely heard it. Before long, she felt a tap on her shoulder and saw the woman with the flag in her hair beckoning to her. Very slowly, she got up. "I don't think she's really Mistress Shannon. She's too friendly with the redcoats," Ellen said to herself. But she hugged the loaf of bread under her jacket and followed her, just the same. They passed the bar and quietly slipped into a room at the back. The woman locked the door behind them. It was a small room, lighted only by a fire of pine knots, and rather crowded, with a large bed in one corner and 2 big chairs by the fireplace. The heavy red curtains in the windows were tightly drawn. In the dim light, Ellen saw a man raised from one of the chairs. To her surprise, she recognized the tall man in the fur hat and the plaid muffler. His eyes were grave as he pulled the muffler from his long chin. Who was wearing a muffler over their face? She recognized him. Do you remember where she saw this man before? Are you thinking? Do you remember at the blacksmith? Right? There was the man sitting in the corner, a really tall man, tallest man she ever saw. He had that scarf, that muffler thing over his face. And she ran away because he was asking her about, "What do you got there? What do you have? Is that your bread? Is there some secret message in your bread?" All right, so here's this man. He stands up from a chair. You're a quick one, he said. You ran away too fast. When he unwound the muffler and took off his hat, his thick white hair fell to his shoulders. Ellen liked his face now that she could see it clearly. It was a strong face with a good wide mouth and ruddy cheeks. She remembered his eyes under his white eyebrows. They had seemed to bore through her jacket in the blacksmith shop, but now they were smiling. He was so tall and rugged, he made her think of a great oak tree in the woods. This is Mr. Shannon, whispered the woman. He has come back sooner than I expected. Was he really Mr. Shannon? Ellen wondered. How could she be so sure? She thought Mr. Shannon would be a round and jolly innkeeper in a long green apron. She thought he might look like her grandfather since they were good friends. And why would Mr. Shannon go after ale for the soldiers if he were expecting an important message? And that woman who said she was his wife was wearing a British flag in her hair. It was rather odd. Is that a loaf of bread you're hiding in your jacket? Mr. Shannon said. Yes, Ellen answered slowly. Is it a present for my birthday? Yes, it is, she cried in surprise. From Van Horn, the barber in New York? Now she was sure. Only Mr. Shannon would know about her grandfather. Here it is, Mr. Shannon, she said eagerly as she slipped the loaf of bread from her jacket. Okay, so here she is. Ellen, Mrs. Shannon. You can't see the British flag in her hair. I feel like they should have drawn that. And then here's Mr. Shannon. Okay, he was wearing that over his face. Standing there in her stocking feet, she curtsied as she handed him the bread and said the words she had carried in her mind all day. I have brought you a present for your birthday. Then she added, my grandfather hurt his ankle this morning and he couldn't walk at all, so he sent me. As she gave the loaf of bread to Mr. Shannon, she felt as if a great load had been lifted from her shoulders. She had delivered grandfather's message. In spite of everything that had happened today, she had delivered the message. Her face was beaming. But how did you get here from New York? Mr. Shannon looked puzzled. Remember, Mr. Shannon thought that it was her grandfather that was going to be coming, not her. I had to walk part of the way. Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Shannon looked puzzled. You were walking, weren't you, when you came into the smithy? I had to walk part of the way, Ellen told him. Not from Amboy, he exclaimed. You couldn't have walked from Amboy. Oh, I got to ride part way with Mr. Murdoch, most of the way. He was going to ride me all the way, but... Mr. Shannon interrupted her. How in the world did you get to Amboy? On a British boat. A soldier. A British boat? He stared at her in disbelief. It was because some boys stole my bread in New York and made me so late I missed the farmers' boats. But how did you get on a British boat? Oh, a man grabbed me. He wanted my loaf of bread. Mr. Shannon stared at her in amazement. And you worked your way through all those troubles to get the bread here to me. Well, we're very grateful for you. Ellen looked up at this very tall man who was in charge of relaying the message to the night-riding couriers. He was smiling at her. She felt like telling him that she really had been scared all the time, but a man like Mr. Shannon wouldn't understand about being afraid. I'd like to stay and have supper with you, he said, but people are waiting to take this message on its way. 3 different couriers will carry it across New Jersey and deliver it tomorrow. So I must hurry to give it to the first man, who lives not far from here. As he tied the bread in his own blue kerchief, he said, Lucky it was that my horse threw a shoe when I started out to look for your grandfather. I got to thinking about you there in the smithy, and I decided I'd better come back to see if you stopped here. Mistress Shannon hugged his arm to her cheek and opened the door to the dark night. A cold gust of wind made her skirts billow out. Be very cautious, she said with concern. There are redcoats everywhere. After she had bolted the door, she hurried to the hearth and poked at the fire until it blazed up enough to brighten the room. She pulled a small log from a box and added it to the fire. I'm going to stop there. This was a little bit longer than I wanted. It's about 15 minutes. So think about that. I mean, even Mr. Shannon is in shock about what Ellen went through, right? She was just going on. She knew she had to get this bread. Went through so much, and we'll talk about this when I finish the book next time, okay? All right, so I hope you enjoyed listening. We'll finish it probably whenever I get on here again to read it. And And there we are. All right. I'm so happy Ellen finally got there. Bye.